Since 2006, Mexico's war on organized crime has left behind a staggering death toll. More than 360,000 homicides have been recorded since the government launched its militarized campaign against the cartels. In 2007, Mexico saw roughly 8,000 homicides. By 2024, that number had climbed over 33,000 in a single year. These are not just street gangs. Some cartels move like paramilitary forces, with armored trucks, high-powered rifles, drones, roadblocks, encrypted communications, and convoys built to challenge the state itself. Behind the violence is a criminal economy worth billions: cocaine, fentanyl, meth, extortion, human smuggling, illegal mining, fuel theft, kidnapping, and money laundering. Today's cartels and gangs are not just fighting over drugs, they are fighting over territory, ports, prisons, migration routes, local governments, and entire communities. So how did we get here? How did drug traffickers become private armies? How did prison gangs become international networks? And how did the cocaine empires of the 1980s evolve into the criminal superpowers we see today? To understand how we got here, you have to go back to Colombia in the late 1970s. Before fentanyl, before CJNG, before the modern cartel wars in Mexico, there was cocaine. At the time, demand for cocaine in the United States was exploding, and Colombia was perfectly positioned to become the center of the trade. Coca leaves were grown in the Andes, coca paste could be moved from Peru and Bolivia into Colombia, and from there, traffickers refined it into cocaine, packed it onto planes and boats, and moved it north toward the United States. Out of this system came the Medellín cartel. It was not a cartel in the corporate sense. It was a loose alliance of traffickers, pilots, assassins, money launderers, corrupt officials, and smugglers built around one goal: move as much cocaine as possible into the United States. At the center was Pablo Escobar. Escobar did not invent the cocaine trade, but he helped industrialize it. The Medellín cartel built air routes through the Caribbean, used private aircraft and remote landing strips, and turned cocaine trafficking into a multinational criminal enterprise. By the mid-1980s, Medellín had become one of the most powerful criminal organizations on Earth. But what made Medellín different was not just the money, it was the violence. Escobar and the cartel used a simple strategy against anyone who stood in their way: plata o plomo, silver or lead, take the bribe or take the bullet. Police officers, judges, journalists, politicians, and presidential candidates became targets. The cartel was not just trying to avoid the state, it was trying to intimidate the state into submission. This is where the modern cartel model begins to take shape. A criminal group with billions in drug money, a supply chain stretching across continents, a private army of assassins, a network of corrupt officials, and enough influence to challenge a national government. The Medellín cartel showed the world that drug trafficking could become more than smuggling. It could become power. But the same violence that made Medellín feared also made it impossible to ignore.
Peter Jennings.
Good evening. Once again, the day's news is dominated by the struggle to win a war against the drug cartels in Colombia and to shape a presidential drug policy which will prove effective for the United States. President Bush has spent the day in Maine working on the overall concept to fight illegal drugs, which he'll present to the nation next Tuesday. In Colombia, further response from the drug cartels to the government's crackdown there. On the one hand, more violence. On the other, a suggestion of negotiations.
As the cartel declared war on the Colombian state, bombings, assassinations, and mass killings pushed Colombia into crisis. Escobar became the most hunted man in the country, and when the Colombian government, backed by U.S. pressure and intelligence support, finally closed in, the Medellín cartel began to collapse. Pablo Escobar was killed in 1993, but the fall of Medellín did not end the cocaine trade. It changed who controlled it. Because when one empire falls, the roots do not disappear, the money does not disappear, the demand does not disappear. The business simply moves to whoever is ready to take its place. And that is exactly what happened next. As Medellín collapsed, another Colombian organization was already rising: the Cali cartel. The Cali cartel was different. Where the Medellín ruled through fear, Cali ruled through access. Instead of declaring open war on the state, the Cali cartel built a quieter, more sophisticated criminal machine. At the top were the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers and their inner circle. They understood something that Escobar's Medellín cartel often ignored. The more visible you become, the more pressure you attract. So Cali operated less like a private army and more like a criminal corporation. They invested in businesses. They built international distribution networks. They used accountants, lawyers, bankers, front companies, and corrupt officials to move money and protect the organization. Their power came from discretion, bribery instead of bombings, influence instead of open confrontation, surveillance instead of spectacle. The Cali cartel became known for gathering intelligence on enemies, police, politicians, and even rival traffickers. And while Medellín had shown that cocaine could create power, Cali showed that cocaine could be managed like a global business. By the early 1990s, after Escobar's death, Cali became one of the dominant forces in the cocaine trade. But the same pattern repeated. Colombian authorities, backed by U.S. pressure, began targeting Cali's leadership.
Today, I'm committing another $73 million to the Defense Department's $800 million counter-narcotics budget to help support the interdiction efforts in Latin America and the Caribbean.
By the mid-1990s, the cartel's top bosses were captured. And once again, the fall of a major cartel did not end the cocaine trade. It fractured it. The old kingpin model began to break apart. Instead of one dominant empire controlling everything, the cocaine business started spreading across smaller networks, armed groups, brokers, transporters, and regional organizations. And this is one of the most important shifts in the entire story. Because as Colombian cartels weakened, Mexican traffickers became more powerful. For years, Mexican organizations had helped move Colombian cocaine across the border into the United States. At first, many were paid as transporters, but over time, they wanted more than a fee. They wanted a piece of the product, then a piece of the market, then control of the routes themselves. And once the Colombians lost their grip, Mexico's cartels were born. But Mexico's cartels did not rise out of nowhere. Their power came from geography. In the drug trade, the route is everything. The U.S. border became the most valuable criminal real estate in the hemisphere. Every crossing point, every highway, every tunnel, every desert corridor, every port city became part of a larger battle for control. It was a gateway. Control the plaza, and you controlled who could move drugs through it. This is where Mexico's cartel system begins to take shape. Different groups took control of different corridors. Sinaloa, Tijuana, Juarez, the Gulf Cartel. Each one built power around access to the U.S. market, and this changed the entire criminal landscape. The Colombians had built the cocaine empires, but the Mexicans controlled the door. And by the 1990s, the organizations that once transported cocaine for others were becoming cartels in their own right. But once Mexican cartels controlled the door, the next question became obvious. Who controlled the door? Tijuana controlled access into Southern California. Juarez controlled the corridors into Texas and New Mexico. The Gulf Cartel controlled routes through Tamaulipas and into South Texas. And Sinaloa built one of the most flexible trafficking networks in Mexico, moving drugs through multiple corridors. As the money grew, so did the violence. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Mexico's cartel world was becoming more militarized. The clearest example came from the Gulf Cartel. They recruited former members of Mexico's special forces and built an armed enforcement wing. They became known as Los Zetas, and their rise changed everything. Los Zetas were not just traffickers. They brought military tactics into organized crime. They helped transform the cartel war from a fight over drug routes into a fight over territory itself, and the violence became much harder to stop. In 2006, Mexico sent in the military to take that control back. But when cartel leaders were captured or killed, their groups often split apart. Instead of ending the cartels, the war fractured them. By the 2020s, two groups stood above the rest, Sinaloa and CJNG. And now, the business had changed again. Cocaine still mattered, but fentanyl and meth became the new gold rush. The drugs changed. The routes stayed the same, and whoever controlled the routes controlled the power. This is the evolution of cartel power. The Colombian cartels built the cocaine empires. The Mexican cartels took control of the routes into the United States, and Los Zetas helped militarize organized crime. From Medellín to Cali, from Colombia to Mexico, from cocaine to fentanyl. The history of Latin America's cartels is not just a story about drugs, it is a story about power. Who controls the routes? Who controls the money? Who controls the state? and who controls the people caught in between.